This is Sovereign Debt, a podcast on greening the global economy and debt sustainability. I'm your host, Jill Doshi. Hello, everyone. This week's guest needs no introduction to those of us who follow the inner workings of the IMF. Mark Flanagan is Deputy Director of the Strategy and Policy Review Department, SPR, of the IMF. And he has been with the fund since 1998. Is that right?
That's right.
And has held several positions over the years, including Division Chief of the Debt Policy Division that oversees the debt sustainability frameworks. And I can't think of anyone who's better placed to explain the process and some of the current reforms of the DSA. So Mark, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks, Jill. It's nice to see you again. It's a pleasure to be here with your audience as well and to talk about these interesting issues.
Thank you. So before we jump into the DSA, and I desperately want to do that, I just want to put us a little bit in perspective and and get your views. We've been expecting this massive wave of debt defaults ever since the onset of COVID-19, and it really hasn't happened yet. Some of that is because of the policy interventions that happened from the G20 that bought some sovereigns some time. But as we're seeing increasing rates in the advanced economies and the ongoing war in Ukraine and energy disruptions, from your perspective, do you see trouble ahead, or are you thinking that basically, what are you thinking as you look ahead on the horizon?
So first, let me agree with you that it's somewhat surprising we haven't had more restructurings to date. We did enter the pandemic with a lot of countries with high vulnerabilities. I think the reason we haven't is the one you mentioned. There were a lot of policy interventions to help countries, much more than your average global crisis. So that seems to have contained the problem. However, as you intimate, we are now entering a period of rapidly tightening global financial conditions. And we've seen this generate a pretty strong reversal of capital flows. It's especially affecting more recent borrowers like frontier markets and those ones that had pre-existing vulnerabilities like large current account deficits. Now, tightening financial conditions as a general matter will produce some problems. For most countries, however, this is just a liquidity problem, and the layers of the global financial safety net can help them manage it. For instance, some combination of utilizing the reserves, borrowing from the fund, or for some countries, borrowing from regional financing arrangements. The problem comes when you combine tight financial conditions with adverse real shocks. And we have seen that in the last 6 months, particularly in food and energy markets. When that happens, the situation can become more serious. Now, there are such things as IMF adjustment programs that can help countries work through needed adjustments. However, there will be some countries where the shock produces a solvency concern. A lot's going to depend on how long these shocks endure. An extended period of tight financial conditions and high real interest rates, along with low commodity prices, that kind of global environment is famous for producing debt problems in countries. Think back to the 1980s Latin American debt crisis. So we'll have to wait and see. Right now, our frameworks are signaling quite a few countries at risk of debt problems, but our macro forecasts and frameworks at the fund are not yet pointing to the kind of conditions that might tip that into something more systemic. Our global baseline does see a major slowdown next year, does see commodity prices coming down, but it does also see success in bringing inflation under control relatively quickly and thus receding real interest rates and recovery on the horizon in a couple of years. When you read our reports on this, you will also see, though, that we're extraordinarily concerned about downside risks in the present conjuncture. And those downside risks include scenarios that involve extended periods of high real rates and slow growth. And that would be problematic. So bottom line here, Jill, is that we're not projecting a baseline of a lot of debt crises, but there are as elevated a set of risks to this end that I've seen in a long time. So it's of real concern.
This is a perfect pivot into the tools that you use to make these assessments for some of these countries. The IMF has two major functions, correct me if I'm wrong. One is surveillance and the other is lending and kind of stabilizing the situation. And I'm perhaps saying this in very layman's terms and simplifying it, but that's kind of the basics. And so when you're both in a surveillance, kind of looking at countries and analyzing their health, as well as making your lending decisions, one of the major tools that the IMF is using is the debt sustainability analysis. And you've been at the center of a lot of the development of those tools and the use of those tools. Very quickly, and some of our listeners are intimately aware of these. They're either debt managers themselves and have been working with the IMF and I don't want to say negotiating, but kind of definitely developing their DSAs. Others are creditors, policymakers, et cetera. But there's also a lot of other people I know, students as well as people from the environment world and others who are listening who might not know this. So first off, we have two basic frameworks for the DSA. Can you just explain what we have, one for low-income countries and one for more kind of advanced economies? So can you tell us a little bit why we have two frameworks and what are those differences? And then we'll get into kind of the recent reforms.
So we do indeed have two frameworks. One is called our low-income country debt sustainability framework. Our latest one for market access countries is called the Sovereign Risk and Debt Sustainability Framework. Now, the first thing I want to point out is that we have two frameworks, but they're based on a common foundation. There are some common conceptual pillars that underpin each of them. Each of them has an assessment of debt and debt service carrying capacity. Each of them has an assessment of liquidity indicators of stress in a baseline. Each of them has an assessment of solvency indicators of stress in a baseline. Each of them makes an effort to understand how such risks will evolve off baseline in stress scenarios. And finally, in each framework, we have some role for country-specific adjustments and judgment. Now, so if there are common conceptual pillars for these two frameworks, people may wonder, why do we end up with two entirely different approaches? And it has to do with several reasons. So the first thing is data availability. We can use models for market access countries that require more information because they generally have better data available. Think of the United States versus Mali. In the United States, we have a tremendous amount of information we can draw on to help inform our decisions, and we don't have anything near that amount of data available for Mali. So we can use more sophisticated techniques that use more information for market access countries. Second thing I want to point out is that the two sets of countries have very different macro structural characteristics. Low-income countries are typically much less diversified. So think of, again, the United States economy versus, say, the economy of Equatorial Guinea, which is heavily dependent on oil. What that means is that in these low-income countries, they're much more susceptible to what we call structural breaks in the data, regime shifts. Now, these complicate our ability to create certain types of econometric models and to produce certain types of outputs like fan charts. I don't know how much your listeners are familiar with fan charts, but a fan chart, rather than just project a baseline for debt, tries to project a whole range of different outcomes and discuss the probabilities that debt ends up higher or lower, etc. But if you have data that's susceptible to structural breaks, it's much harder to do a fan chart. So these kind of techniques that we do for market access countries, we have trouble doing in a low-income country setting.
So if I can just summarize that, so that's saying both the focus of the data, because their economies are very kind of like you say, non-diversified. So their economies are dependent on a certain thing, as well as the data itself. Like they just actually don't produce quality data, or there's just not enough of it to do sophisticated analysis.
Yeah, so we're constrained. The bottom line is, for those first two things I cited, we're constrained in our ability to use some of the most sophisticated tools in low-income countries. That's the bottom line. We don't want to give them up in advanced economy settings. We certainly want to use them. So that introduces a difference right there. One of the biggest and most important differences is in financing characteristics. Low-income countries access considerable amounts of concessional finance. And concessional finance, for those of your listeners who don't know, is finance on really beneficial terms to a country. You might get a 0% interest rate loan for 30 years. And we think of those kind of loans as having a large grant element. And you can't analyze them in the same way as you analyze a market loan, say from bondholders, which will have a positive interest rate. If you just look at the headline number for debt, they're not equivalent. So you need to make adjustments when you're dealing with countries that use a lot of concessional finance. And I would also add, too, that the structure of creditors is very, very different for low-income countries. They tend to rely on development banks, bilateral official creditors to a much, much greater extent.
Right, and those are the sources of that concessional finance, generally speaking. So it makes sense to me that the data is of different quality and quantitude and sophistication. It makes sense that their borrowing habits are very different and their creditors are different. The risks of those countries are also radically different. If you're a low-income country, like what you're talking about, you know, the Ecuadorian Guineas, the Malis, or whoever, the really frontier markets that are facing very particular development challenges, that's fundamentally different as well from a very sophisticated economy or even a middle-income country that has regular market access. Is that captured as well in the DSA, or is that somewhere else in the surveillance, and how does that factor in?
Well, the risk, it's a good question. I mean, as I mentioned, a common conceptual underpinning of the two frameworks is that we try to model stress scenarios and how they affect the situation. And absolutely, for low-income countries, they are subject to greater degree of shocks, but also they're more susceptible to particular shocks. Now, one of the things we did when we introduced the low-income country debt sustainability framework in 2017, the latest update of it, was we introduced tailored scenario stress tests because we wanted to capture these kind of events more clearly. So we introduced a tailored scenario stress test for natural disasters because many low-income countries are actually highly susceptible to these. There are hurricanes being a terrific example of that, right? And we introduced a tailored scenario stress test for commodity price shocks. Now, you wouldn't do that for the United States because it's too big and diversified. It wouldn't matter. But for a country like Equatorial Guinea, which I mentioned before, which is highly dependent on oil, the price of oil matters dramatically for the country, its fiscal accounts, its debt service, its ability to service debt, etc. But, you know, I'm glad you mentioned frontier economies and frontier markets, because while we have two frameworks, of course, there's always going to be a little bit of a gray area between.
Exactly. You know where I'm going. Exactly.
So, you know, as economies develop and start to move away from concessional financing, right, and take on more and more market finance, you get into this gray area. And, you know, which tools do you apply? Right now, we've introduced some tools into the LIC DSF in 2017 to help analyze market financing related stresses. But we probably, in the next round, when we update the LIC DSF, and that's probably coming in the next 24 to 36 months, we probably need to broaden those tools further. There's an expectation, I know, from coming out of the last review that we try to move the two frameworks closer together, or at least reduce the step between the two and make the handoff between the two a little bit smoother.
Because it's kind of a gradual progression for countries, as we see. I mean, especially depending on the market conditions. I mean, some very low-income countries had market access and took advantage of it. And now suddenly that luxury is disappearing. So
I think that's really where the focus of modeling improvements is going to be over the next few years, trying to handle that gradual development and get the tools in a place where they can more gradually hand off the analysis of low income considerations into market access considerations. So we'll be working on that. We will be working on that.
And then just to follow up on this natural disaster, that the low-income countries, the LIC DSF right now does address some of these, as you say, kind of high-impact shocks. More generally, with kind of the trend of thinking about climate change, adaptation, transition, and all of this, are some of those just bigger needs, kind of bigger structural needs, not necessarily shocks, like being worked into the frameworks as well? And that actually goes for both LIC and MAC DSA. But
we have, in fact, of course, our most recent review of a framework was for the MAC DSA, and that produced a sovereign risk and debt sustainability framework. So we have actually brought in modules to help consider these kinds of risks into that framework. And it's a pretty good prediction that those will find their way into the LIC DSF framework at the next review. You know, beyond natural disasters, and it's fairly easy to come up with a tailored stress test for that. And some of your readers or listeners might wonder why it's fairly easy. Because for many of these countries, actually, they've been hit by 5 hurricanes before. And we have a pretty good idea of how it affects their economy. So, you know, you can literally set up a tool based on previous experience. Oftentimes, the previous experience of the exact country in question. And even if you don't have data for the country in question, you have pretty good idea about the impact of such natural disasters like droughts, hurricanes, etc. There is data on them. So that's pretty easy to do. Now, the issue with climate change, global warming and rising sea levels, is that it's gradual and cumulative, right? And it has profound effects over the long term, but they're gradual and cumulative. So it's not like a stress test where you can pick out a big event and try to model it. You have to look at things like how will spending for adaptation to climate change affect the fiscal accounts and the debt outlook, and how will spending for mitigation affect the outlook, because countries have to do both, right? Adaptation being things like, changing crop varieties, because all of a sudden it's a drier climate, or building higher dikes to guard against sea levels. And mitigation is things like reducing carbon emissions. And there's a lot of investment needed for that purpose, for instance, in electric charging infrastructure. So we do ask countries to consider these things. And you may wonder, well, what do we know about these issues? We're not scientists, but there are ways to get around these things, because there are a lot of people who have studied these.
I was just going to say, I can introduce you to lots of people who do. I'm getting into the weeds on this stuff. So yeah.
Yeah. So
the data's there.
There are papers out there that estimate the cost of adaptation investment for a large set of countries. For instance, one by Alegishev, Belon, and Massetti just this year. And they focus on the costs over the next 5 years of strengthening existing assets and new investments in areas already exposed to natural disasters and increasing coastal protection. These are some of the more important near-term investments. On mitigation expenditures and investments, the European Commission has estimates of the upfront investment that would be needed in green technology and infrastructure to jumpstart a market shift to clean energy production, to attain net zero carbon emission targets over a specified time frame.
Those are generally huge numbers, right? So
they are. So one of the difficulties is, of course, so we can use these kind of estimates to work into our baseline forecasts. What's a little trickier is modeling how it reduces risk. You know, as somebody who's worked in the trade, you know that oftentimes it's not the baseline that gets you, it's the shock around the baseline that'll knock a country into debt distress. So what a lot of these investments do is they reduce that risk, right? So you get hit by a hurricane, but you've got a resilient infrastructure. The costs are a lot lower, and you may not be tipped into debt distress. So at the moment, you know, these considerations are difficult to quantify. I mean, long-term fan charts are, by definition, very, very wide, right? So they're not particularly useful.
No, and exactly. And the as you said, then it's also requiring a lot of collaboration with scientists to just understand that there will be increased frequency of these events as well.
That's right. So the bottom line is, for us, you know, we can come up with some starting point for a team, but these modules are largely judgmental. Use that term. It's not easily quantifiable, not easily modeled. You can get somewhere with estimates. Then you got to make some judgments about, you know, the benefit it'll bring in terms of lowered volatility of an economy, the costs it'll bring in higher debt service, and weigh these to think about how in the long term it'll affect risk.
But I think the one takeaway for the audience is really to hear that the IMF is very serious about these kind of long-term and by implication, medium and potentially short-term shocks, kind of risks and issues, and is working and striving to incorporate this into the frameworks and models, and presumably is open to engaging with scientists and others to kind of make sure that all the understanding is being captured. Correct?
Exactly. These are very serious risks. In an extreme, there are some of our island members that may not exist in 100 years. Exactly. That's the ultimate in a debt sustainability problem. You know, on the other side, there are countries that will not have the same severe impact of climate change, but will have to spend a lot nonetheless to deal with some of the mitigation requirements. So it is a very serious issue. I would characterize global understanding as closer to nascent than well developed at the moment, but we're working on it. And yes, we have to collaborate very carefully with the people who understand the science of this.
And of course, I mean, just to touch on and to make a plug for an earlier episode, is that there's also the IMF Resilience Sustainability Trust that's being launched, and which we had another episode all on. So, you know, that's another indication that this is becoming more and more part of the frameworks and thinking of the IMF and generally of the multilaterals, hopefully. But going back to the DSA and going back to our frontier economies that kind of wobble a little bit between the two frameworks, and that potentially are now under enormous stress and are potentially going to be needing to come to the IMF for assistance. Maybe we just walk us through the process of how that works. So the countries in stress comes to the IMF, you know, after usually much reluctance and delay, usually probably later in the process than is helpful, but they finally have come to the IMF and say, we need assistance. The IMF team arrives and starts gathering information and making their models, whichever framework is appropriate, and starts doing the DSA. What happens then? Is the DSA negotiated with the sovereign? Can you explain how that works, and then importantly, how then we start actually sharing that information or not sharing with other participants?
Okay, so this is an interesting issue. And let me say, of course, the debt sustainability assessment is an IMF assessment in the case of the Sovereign Risk and Debt Sustainability Framework. For the Low-Income Debt Sustainability Framework, it is a joint IMF World Bank assessment.
Oh, yeah, of course. That's an important point. Yeah.
So we will, when we go to a country, what we will do is we will collect all the information and data we need to make a preliminary assessment. And we will do that. And we will put it in front of the authorities and discuss with them. Now, let's imagine a circumstance where because we've concluded that debt is unsustainable, the country elects to pursue a restructuring with its creditors. Now, this raises some difficult issues with the DSA because importantly, what happens is the DSA ends up effectively establishing the repayment envelope for the restructuring. So it's of great interest to private creditors and official creditors, naturally, because it's going to determine how much the country can repay them in effect. So they have a great interest to see it and to comment on it and to talk to people about it. Now, I can tell you that we do share DSAs with creditors. We do certainly share them also indirectly through a country's financial and economic advisors, who certainly have to explain to the creditors the basis for which they're asking for a particular design of a restructuring. But we do sit down with creditors. I've done it myself on 2 occasions, Greece in 2012 and Ukraine in 2015, both of which were very large restructurings. And for both of which, and just to illustrate to your listeners how sensitive it could be, I think in Greece we calculated that every 0.1% of additional long-term growth was worth $250 million in additional repayment capacity. So that's a lot of money over a decimal point. So you can imagine they were very interested in discussing this. Now, and we do sit down and listen to private creditors' views. And, I can tell you that at least when I've been involved, we have gone in with an open mind. We have been willing to listen to considerations they wish to raise. We've been willing even to make changes to our framework if something is presented to us that makes a convincing case that maybe one of the economic relationships we've modeled is a little bit too conservative. So we are willing to do that. We do approach these things with open minds. But I do want to say that 2 things. One is that there's another side to this. There's also civil society, and they often get to see DSAs as well, although admittedly more ex post, and they have views on DSAs, and they generally are concerned that DSAs are not too conservative in the sense of removing too much space for social spending and development spending. So there's actually two counterbalancing forces here when there's a DSA on the table that have very different views on which direction it should go. One wants a more liberal interpretation, more optimistic assumptions to generate more of a repayment capacity. The other wants less optimistic assumptions in order to generate more of a capacity to spend on development and social safety nets. The evidence suggests that we tend to err on the too optimistic side when we do DSAs, on average. That's not in every case. Now, that being said, I think we do have a responsibility to listen to both sides, and every case is specific. So we have a responsibility to listen to both sides and to try to get it right in each case. But it's a difficult process. You're talking about modeling economic relationships under high uncertainty for situations that could involve a lot of intervening shocks. So there's a lot of uncertainty.
But to unpack some of that, so at least kind of what I witness and see, which is obviously from a different perspective, but I think civil society is usually a little bit more agitated about kind of the conditionality of the whole IMF program and kind of the austerity measures usually, and kind of, like you said, kind of cutting back on social spending and other things, and just kind of shrinking budgets and having to reprioritize, government, the fiscal agenda during a crisis. So that's kind of what I've witnessed more, rather than them really getting into the weeds of a DSA. For the DSA, I really feel that that's kind of other creditors, the private creditors, bondholders, and others who are saying this is very much a tool for. They recognize that this is a tool for IMF lending purposes and for your own assessment of a country and how you can kind of enter into the situation and lend and shape your program. But it also, as you say, effectively sets the parameter and the envelope for the whole game, so to speak. And I think private creditors want to have some sort of process where, and I think they concede that they're not going to be negotiating and kind of having a massive impact on it, but at least that they have full transparency on what is going into it, what is going out, because they, as market participants, are obviously going to have a different view amongst themselves, right? That's what makes a market. So they just need to kind of actually see not just the framework, but actually what's going into it earlier rather than later. And I suppose part of that is that they want to put pressure on you. But at the moment, when you go in, the DSA is really for IMF purposes of designing the program with the country and understanding the institution's ability to lend into that situation and saying, is the debt sustainable or not sustainable? And if it's not sustainable, then there needs to be some sort of action. And this is where we get into, as a country, you're either going to have to run arrears to these creditors and not pay them during the program period, or you're going to have to restructure and come up with an agreement that you're also not going to pay them during the program period, but through some sort of negotiation. So am I understanding? I mean, is there anything that you want to kind of pick on that statement?
Well, there's a couple of points I want to make. I mean, yeah, I think primarily people think of the DSA as being for establishing repayment envelope and affecting relations with private creditors. But the biggest thing that determines the repayment envelope, one of the biggest assumptions, is the primary surplus that a country is going to run over a long period of time. And that connects directly back to the austerity policies. Now, I've had the pleasure over the years of helping the fund deal with civil society organizations who understand this link from austerity policies to the assumptions made for the purposes of restructuring. They understand it very, very clearly. And their view is that we get it wrong. They have such a strong view about this that they believe that the DSA should be out of the IMF's hands and in the hands of an independent institution. Now, I don't want to dwell too much on that there are multiple problems with such an approach, not least summoning sufficient country-specific expertise if you've got an independent institution, but also the link through to the discussion over policies, which affects the DSA dramatically. So I think some of the ideas to try to rectify this are a little bit misplaced. But the point I want to make is that these guys do care a lot. They do care a lot about how the DSA is rendered in a restructuring. They just get a little less access during the process and end up as critics after the process once they see it. So that is an issue we have to address as well in outreach. Now, the one point I want to make, though, and I think you're raising an important issue about private creditors, is is you raise this issue that there's not a common view amongst private creditors even. And that's legitimate. We're dealing with modeling a difficult situation under a lot of uncertainty. There are going to be a lot of views about what.
That's why there's a market, right?
The market mediates these views, but if you choose the 20 creditors who are involved and sit them down in a room, they're going to have different views. And they may have a different view from us. They may have a different view from the country authorities, from CSOs, et cetera. And one of the real difficulties, as you know, in a restructuring is trying to deal with all those differences of views. And it's not easy at the moment. I think you're absolutely right. There is a need for people to be informed about the macro framework that's being used. I think it's valuable for the fund to hear feedback from all sources about how we've modeled things. I mean, as I say, we want to get it right ultimately. We have a responsibility to get it right. We're not supposed to support a case that's over restructured. So we have a responsibility to get it right. But you often in these restructuring situations, as you know, get to a point where there's just a difference between what the IMF assesses and what creditors believe is reasonable. And that has to be bridged somehow. There are ways to do this, but they're not very effective. And you know some of them, like value recovery instruments, which have a very checkered history.
But I want to kind of shift it, because as an advisor to actual governments, I'm always thinking of the actual country in distress, right? And from that perspective, what you want to try to get to is, okay, like I said, you've delayed it as long as possible. You've been through hell. You finally decided, okay, I've got to call in the IMF. I can't avoid this anymore. I'm going to have to bite the bullet and do it. You call in the IMF. And what you want then is a speedy resolution and an effective process and an efficient process. And I think what we're seeing in the old days, it was kind of a little bit easier because we had alignment between the major creditors, both official and private, who were banks, and the shareholders of the IMF. And, the process was kind of relatively speedy. In today's world, it's much more diverse. It's much more complicated. We have a lot of different players with different views. And I think from a debtor country's perspective, this actually then ends up causing a lot of delay. And we're trying to figure out, I think all of us are trying to figure out, how do we make the process work in such so that it goes a bit more smoothly. And the DSA, it seems, is critical, because the DSA is when you come in and you say, okay, debt is unsustainable. And in order for the IMF program, even if we've agreed with civil society and everybody else and all of the other kind of actors and stakeholders, but you've agreed a program, to the best of everyone's ability, and you want to move forward, but the debt is unsustainable. And now we need to restructure. And we have this habit that we have to go to the official sector first and to the private sector. and that was kind of just the way it used to go. And now the official sector is a little bit harder, almost, it's as hard as the private sector, if not harder now. And I think some of what the conversation is about is there a different way of doing this? Can we get the private sector in earlier and then work with the official sector? Or is there a way to provide those financing assurances to the IMF more quickly so that the relief can actually flow more quickly? And I think that's kind of what we're all kind of stuck on, at least from my perspective.
No, I think you summarize it very well. And I think I know you had a recent op-ed in the FT that I thought summarized it very well as well. But yes, the creditor landscape has become more complex than the system that was set up to handle restructurings. system was well set up to deal with Paris Club creditors and bondholders, and it's just expanded beyond that. I think there's another element to it that I think we're watching carefully, which is growing complexity of instruments out there. We've got, of course, collateral's always been around, but we've seen an uptick in the usage of collateral, and those kind of security interests can greatly complicate a restructuring. They are restructurable. It all depends on the legal tightness of the security interest, but it does create problems. But even beyond that, derivatives, swaps, public-private partnerships, all sorts of non-traditional debt-like mechanisms that are out there. Some of them we haven't even encountered yet in restructuring situations, but there will be big debates over how to treat them. So it's, yes, creditor landscape becoming much more complex, instrument landscape becoming much more complex. It creates big problems of burden sharing, big problems of first mover. Who's going to go first? Because everybody else, wants to see what the other does before stepping in and offering to go ahead. And I think the first mover problem is also complicated by the fact that, yes, in the background, there's a DSA. There's an evolving macroeconomic forecast. Everybody knows this too. In a crisis, information is fluid, developments are fluid, the DSA can change. Everybody has an incentive to wait. Maybe it'll get better. Maybe in 6 months, the DSA will look better. Sometimes it does. So yes, there's a reason why they want to do this. So yeah, I agree with you. In the background, there's this DSA that has a critical role, but it's very difficult to bridge some of these issues, like the time dimension. Why don't we just wait and see if things get better? In an earlier time, that was known as leading to the gambling. It was gambling for redemption, leading to too little, too late problems. And the other problem being just the raw uncertainty surrounding a DSA forecast in the middle of a crisis. Those are very difficult issues to bridge, and if we had a good way of bridging them, it would go faster. And maybe for your listeners, a good analogy is corporate bankruptcies. I mean, in some respects, it's much easier, right? So a restaurant chain goes bankrupt. I mean, you can sit down and you can estimate, how many stores do we close? Which ones were profitable? How much income could we expect to get out of the rump of this corporation? So you can define a repayment capacity much more simply. If you're dealing with an entire country and all the diverse elements affecting its ability to repay, many of which are way beyond its control, like small commodity producers, for instance. They don't set commodity prices, they take them from the global market. When you're dealing with that much more, that much larger situation with so many more influences, it's much, much more difficult to set a repayment envelope. And it leads to longer and more contentious restructuring negotiations. We haven't found a good way around that. There have been efforts, as I mentioned earlier, value recovery instruments, but these are not really a solution. I mean, they tend to be illiquid. Creditors don't like them because they're illiquid and hard to value. Borrowers don't like them because ex post they tend to be expensive. So they're not a solution, but in theory they offer a solution, right? Because in theory they can bridge all these differences, but it's just impossible, it seems, to design one that in any specific case turns out in a way that people would support. So it's going to remain a bit of a problem, unfortunately. What we can do, I think, you zeroed in on it. What we can do is talk to people, explain the situation, listen, and do our best. The broader architectural issues there are some solutions that have been vetted there. They're difficult. I mean, the highest priority right now is to try to come up with a framework to restructure official creditors in a sort of post-Paris Club landscape. As you've hinted, it's actually become probably more difficult to restructure official creditors these days than private creditors. So there's a big priority on what we're calling the common framework.
I think the largest creditor, the largest official creditor out there, China, is still figuring out, from my perspective, they're still figuring out what they want and what their objectives are and what they want to do. They for whatever reason, they're not wanting to just sign up for the Paris Club and to join kind of the established things. And they have a different approach. And we've talked about this on the podcast and other episodes of their entities, their lending entities are kind of fall in kind of different categories or kind of, they're just different. It is taking some time for them to figure out how they're going to handle situations. And so I think we see it evolving and their participation in the common framework, but it is still slow. And I think that's part of the frustration on the part of the private sector as well as the debtor countries is why do we have to wait for them, right? And why don't, like them being not just China, but just the whole official sector to sort themselves out? Can't we kind of come first, so to speak? And can't we speed this up in some other ways so that financing assurances can be given in a different way? Maybe let me just take the opportunity with you here. With financing assurances in IMF policy can only be given by a standing representative, forum of official creditors, correct? Or let me just ask it differently. What are financing assurances to you?
Financing assurances in the context of restructuring are complex. The underlying principle is that we need specific and credible financing assurances in the context of restructuring. So we've long understood ourselves as receiving those from the Paris Club. And that gives us a little bit of guidance as to what this means in practice. And what it means in practice is that the creditors have seen what a country will need in order to fix its gap to sustainability. They have seen the kind of solutions that will generate a closure of that gap. And as you know, as a practitioner in this area, there's never one solution. You can always have different
there's all the Paris Club terms and different terms for different types of countries. And lots of...
They've seen roughly the kind of space for solutions. And someone from the creditor country with the ability to commit has signaled that they're willing to make it happen. So that's how we understand it. So if we have the Paris Club, we also we know that they've been doing this for 30 years. So we know that when they reach a certain point in their processes, we're comfortable that we've received these specific and credible assurances. But once we get outside of the Paris Club,
exactly,
we're left trying to figure out, have we received a specific and credible assurance? And to go back to your earlier discussion about new creditors, they don't have evolved processes, even internally, and they're not part of the Paris Club. So they can have difficulty extending these specific and credible assurances, even if they want to, in some of their domestic institutions. Because they don't have the internal processes, it takes them time to generate these.
Here's a question for you. Can, in theory, a forum of private creditors give, theoretically, can they give credible and specific financing assurances if they are a significant portion of the... And I'm not going to go so far as to say you'd have reverse comparability on the official sector, because I know that's like the third rail and makes everyone hysterical. But is it conceivable that they could give credible, or is the idea that they can't do that because they don't know what the official sector is doing yet? and because there is no reverse comparability, the whole kind of thing falls apart.
Well, we have a slightly different way of handling private creditors. And private creditors, for the purposes of assurances in a restructuring context, we make an assessment, and we essentially make an assessment of whether the process in train is likely to lead to a restructuring outcome consistent with program assumptions on the need to fill a financing gap. So we have some leeway there. We have a little bit more leeway there with how we judge these things. And typically we look for some threshold to be crossed in the process to give us confidence that such a process is underway. Sometimes that can be, depending on how complex the restructuring is. If it's a very simple restructuring, or it looks to be a very simple restructuring, sometimes just the announcement and the hiring of legal and financial advisors can give us confidence to move forward. Sometimes with a more complex restructuring, it may require a further step in the process to get us confident that the process is going to deliver. So we have a little bit more leeway there. And certainly we watch the process carefully and what stage it's at, what signals are coming from creditors. And we form a judgment. So it's a little bit different than for official creditors, where we have more of a specific and credible assurance requirement.
It's more procedural. Just you have to see that it's kind of going and it's happening in good faith, and everyone seems to kind of accept more or less kind of the parameters of what the situation is as you see it.
Yeah, not even that, believe it or not. Because of course, as we discussed earlier, not everybody is going to accept the parameters. And depending on the debt instrument with collective action clauses, some people are going to get crammed down. So we don't need everybody on board. We just have to assess that the process is likely to be successful. So it doesn't mean everybody necessarily agrees. We just have to assess that it's heading in that direction and can deliver consistent with program terms. So private creditors, yes, it's a different approach, but it goes back to your point that it's become a little bit more difficult with official creditors once we've moved beyond the established mechanisms like the Paris Club. We're into uncharted territory with the new creditors, and it's difficult for them, difficult for the international community. And it bears mentioning, to go back to your point about frustrations, countries are frustrated. I think all creditors, if they step back, will realize it's not in their interest to drag out a restructuring. It actually negatively affects a country's repayment capacity to get into a long and extended dispute without the country having access to finance for development, for investment, etc. So it's in nobody's interest. I think everybody is frustrated when these things take a long time. And yes, there's an imperative to try to improve the efficiency of these processes, an absolute imperative.
I mean, it is a very difficult landscape out there. And I think there's a lot of us just trying to figure out, are there any ways, either kind of in terms of frameworks and agreements or actually contractual ways to speed up the process, because like you said, the longer these restructurings take and the longer IMF assistance is delayed because the financing assurances are not delivered, the situation on the ground in the country deteriorates even further, and we just have a worsening problem. And then unfortunately those situations then signal to other countries, ooh, this process is really difficult and messy, I better not get into it. And so then they get into all of this avoidance tactics and not wanting to come forward and do it because it looks like really the end of the, Armageddon when you have.
Yeah, no, indeed. Well, so there are lots of proposals on the table to try to address that. I don't think we've fully maxed out the contractual approach to dealing with private creditor debt. The contractual approach, for those of your listeners who aren't familiar, seeks to build into debt contracts legal features that facilitate restructuring situations. The most notable one is a collective action clause, which allows a supermajority of creditors to bind remaining creditors on changes in terms in a debt contract. But there are other things now being looked at. These kind of collective action clauses and essentially majority voting provisions do not exist, for instance, in syndicated bank loans right now. And there are initiatives underway to try to extend them more broadly. But there are other features that can be introduced into debt contracts that can facilitate things. You mentioned one in your recent FT op-ed. And a specific example of that is a climate resilient feature in a contract. But basically, they work in the same way. Some kind of a trigger event happens. And if that trigger event happens, a country gets to delay its debt service payments. And it can be positive for both debtors and lenders. Why? Because for the debtor, usually the trigger event is fairly serious, right? It's a hurricane, a natural disaster, some kind of other serious event. And oftentimes, the debtor really needs the funds in order to address the situation at hand. And it's in everybody's interest that they have those funds to address the situation at hand.
And that's why I was trying to think of, when speaking about, natural disasters and everything, and pandemics, and instead of having a laundry list of all the horrible things that could happen to a country, why don't we just have the clause say, when the wheels fall off the bus and you have to call in the IMF, why isn't that the trigger? And that there might be some way of using that potentially could just actually provide you with some very specific financing assurances, at least from the private sector. And we could think of similar sort of clauses to be inserted in the concessional finance or official financing that also says, like, listen, when you've hit the wall, we automatically suspend, kind of like a little mini DSSI. We'll just automatically suspend if you get to that point, so that when a country does reach that point, they know that calling in the IMF and agreeing a staff level or getting staff level approval for a program would, in fact, result in something very tangible for them. So there is a carrot for them as well to go into the process. I don't know. I'm just trying to get creative.
Well, no, but I think you touch on a key issue here. I've had the pleasure of observing some discussions over the years about such instruments, and a lot of the focus does revolve around what is the trigger event in order to get this debt service relief or debt relief, and this is actually enormously difficult to resolve. Creditors, or at least people representing them, tend to favor trigger events that are objective and totally outside of a country's control.
Absolutely.
So, and so the IMF, if that's the metric, the IMF is going to be in a gray zone for a lot of these guys, right? Because calling in the IMF is not necessarily outside of a country's control. So it might be that kind of proposal would not necessarily fly with all creditors. Though in theory, I get where you're coming from in concept, but in creditors may be reluctant to do that. But that is the essence of it. They want to prevent moral hazard. They want a trigger that is outside of a country's control. So in the limited examples of these things that we know of, you're aware of things like the hurricane clauses in Grenada's debt and in Barbados' debt. It's tied to an objective external indicator of, a big hurricane hitting. And that's
Barbados just did one for a pandemic as well. And I think there's all sorts of, again, kind of trigger events.
That's right. You can rely on like a WHO declaration, right, for a pandemic. So that's for your listeners, that's what we mean about objective and outside of a country's control. A hurricane, clearly, there are people who will tell you exactly how big it was, et cetera. For pandemic, you got the WHO. So that's typically what creditors like. And it's hard to find, for all the events that could really hit a country, it's hard to find all these objective triggers. So I understand where you're coming from.
Yeah, so I'm just basically saying, instead of trying to and with the uncertainty in the world, we just don't know, right? We don't expect like a massive earthquake with a flooding or tsunamis or what. I don't know. Like, I'm sure some scientists know, but those of us writing bond contracts don't know. But what we do know is when a country suddenly can't pay, and needs to call in the IMF, and we know that they don't take that decision lightly. So they're not going to just do that just to game the system and avoid a year's payment. No one wants you to show up. sorry, Mark.
Well, no, don't apologize. I know that. 30 years of working at the fund.
Exactly. They're quite impressed when either one of us show up.
Yeah. So, and frankly, we don't like showing up. We'd rather our surveillance worked, right, and kept the country out of trouble, right? That's our job, to keep them out of trouble. But I think this touches on precisely the issue with these things. In concept, everybody agrees, but the devil is in the details. And right. This tension between a creditor's desire for exactness to ensure objectivity and the messiness of the world, which militates against being too exact, and trying to find a solution that would satisfy people. It's not an easy issue, but it's good that people are talking about this and putting these issues on the table.
Great. Well, Mark, I know I've taken up more time than I said I would, and I appreciate so much your coming on and sharing this. I have a sense that you'll have to come back, and we'll have to get even deeper into some of these at some of these points as it develops. But I want to give you the last word. Is there anything that you want to leave our listeners with, whether they're debt managers or other policymakers? Or
debt managers know this, but I think it's worth repeating. Analyzing the risk of stress and default is really a complex task. And our new DSA tool has tried to capture a lot of the complications with such analyses and has tried to automate the effort to work through these calculations. Now, we've made every effort to make our new tools accessible and intuitive, but it is fundamentally a complicated exercise for anyone to work through. So we encourage those who have questions to get in touch with us. We do offer technical assistance to debt managers, subject, of course, to our staff availability. In some instances, for the lower income and lower middle income countries, that can even be funded by donors. Now, and for all the others who do not need our assistance, all the other debt managers who don't need our assistance, we're looking forward to working with you on introducing our new debt sustainability analyses in the context of our surveillance and our lending work. And I want to emphasize, we're very happy to engage and talk about these things. These frameworks are meant to generate discussion and help you think through these issues. So please do engage with us.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you.
Thanks, Jill. Until next time.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, leave us a review and subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts.